The late afternoon sun hung low over Manchester, New Hampshire, casting long shadows across the brick sidewalks and glinting off the windows of the community center where a crowd was gathering. Inside, folding chairs filled quickly, some folks in work boots and flannel, others in crisp blazers, a few in faded military caps. They'd come to hear Karoline Leavitt speak. She'd been all over the news lately, sharp, articulate, always camera-ready, and tonight was part of a statewide tour promoting her party's new plan for veterans. Posters near the entrance showed her shaking hands with soldiers, smiling beside American flags, promising real support, not just words. In the third row from the back, near the aisle, sat Delia Rojas. She wore a plain navy jacket, her dark hair pulled back in a loose bun, no buttons, no signs, just a worn leather notebook in her lap and a thermos of black coffee at her feet. She wasn't there to cause a scene. Truth was, she almost didn't come at all. But something about the flyer, honoring our heroes with action, had tugged at her. Maybe it was hope, or maybe it was just habit. After 22 years in the Army, including 2 grueling tours in Iraq as a combat medic, Delia had seen too many promises evaporate like morning mist. She'd left the service 5 years ago, not because she wanted to, but because her knees gave out and the VA paperwork felt like running through mud with boots full of water. Now she worked part-time at a local veterans outreach center, helping others navigate the same labyrinth she'd barely escaped. She knew the system's cracks better than most, knew which clinics were understaffed, which counselors were stretched thin, which families got lost in the shuffle while politicians gave speeches about sacred duties. The room buzzed with polite chatter. A man in a Marine Corps ball cap chatted with his wife about gas prices. 2 college students whispered about extra credit for attending. Up front, campaign staffers adjusted microphones and tested lights. Then the side door opened and Karoline Leavitt walked in. She moved with practiced ease, confident stride, warm smile, hand already outstretched to greet the first person she passed. She wore a tailored suit, not flashy but expensive looking. Her voice carried easily as she thanked the organizers, cracked a light joke about New England weather, and settled behind the podium. The crowd quieted. For the first 10 minutes, it was smooth sailing. She spoke about patriotism, about service, about the debt the country owed its veterans. She cited numbers, funding increases, new hiring goals, expanded telehealth options. She sounded sincere. She even mentioned a bill she'd helped draft that would cut red tape for disability claims. People nodded. Some clapped. Delia listened, pen hovering over her notebook. She didn't write anything down. Not yet. Then Karoline said it. Thanks to our efforts, wait times for mental health care at VA facilities have dropped significantly. Veterans are getting the help they need when they need it. That's when Delia's stomach tightened. She remembered Javier. Not his real name, but the one she used in her notes to protect his privacy. He'd been Army, like her, served in Mosul, came home with nightmares he couldn't outrun. He'd called the VA hotline every Monday for 3 months straight, trying to get an appointment with a therapist. Every time he was told someone would call him back. No one ever did. On the 4th month, he stopped calling. 2 weeks later, his sister found him in his garage. Delia had held his sister's hands at the funeral. She'd also held the VA's automated voicemail transcript, 27 calls, all logged, none returned. Now, sitting in this bright, air-conditioned room, hearing those words, getting the help they need, and felt like swallowing glass. Karoline kept going, her tone upbeat, her gestures open. "We're turning the page," she said. "No more empty gestures, just real results." A man near the front raised his hand and asked about housing assistance for homeless vets. Karoline answered smoothly, mentioning a new partnership with a nonprofit. Then a woman asked about job training. Again, Karoline had a ready answer. Grants, certifications, employer incentives. Everything sounded clean, organized, almost easy. But Delia knew better. She'd spent last Tuesday helping a former Navy cook fill out the same form for the 3rd time because the online portal kept crashing. She'd driven another vet, an older guy with Parkinson's, to a VA office an hour away because his local clinic had no neurologist on staff. She'd stayed up until 2 a.m., helping a young woman appeal a denied claim for PTSD, her voice shaking over the phone as she described flashbacks she'd never told anyone about. This wasn't about politics. It was about people, real, tired, hurting people who kept showing up, kept trying even when the system failed them again and again. The Q&A began. Hands went up. Karoline moved through them with grace, never flustered, always on message. Delia watched, her coffee gone cold. She wasn't angry, not exactly. More like tired of hearing polished words that didn't match lived reality. Tired of watching veterans get used as props in speeches while their actual needs gathered dust in bureaucratic drawers. Then, almost without deciding, she stood. Her legs felt stiff. Her heart thudded, but her voice when it came was calm. "Ma'am," she said, loud enough to be heard but not shouting. "You mentioned mental health wait times going down. I work with veterans every day, and I just buried a friend last month who waited 4 months for a single counseling session. He didn't make it to his appointment." The room went still. Even the air seemed to pause. Karoline turned toward her, expression unreadable for a split second. Surprise? Concern? Before settling into something professional. "I'm so sorry for your loss," she said. "That's heartbreaking. But the data shows improvement across the board." Delia didn't let her finish. Not rudely, but firmly. Data doesn't sit with a mother who just lost her son because the system moved too slow. Data doesn't answer the phone at 3 a.m. when a veteran's at the end of his rope. "I was there, ma'am. I held his dog tags the day he died, and I've held too many like them." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The weight of what she said filled the room. Karoline blinked. For the first time all night, she didn't have a ready quote. She looked at Delia, not past her, not at the cameras, but right at her, and something shifted in her eyes. Not defensiveness, not dismissal, something closer to recognition, but that moment would come later. For now, Delia sat back down, her hands trembling slightly in her lap. The crowd was silent. No one clapped. No one booed. They just sat there, caught between a polished narrative and a truth that couldn't be spun away. Outside, the sun dipped below the rooftops. Inside, something had changed quietly, irrevocably, and neither woman knew yet where it would lead. The silence stretched just long enough to feel heavy, like the kind that settles after thunder cracks too close. No one shifted in their seats. No one whispered. Even the campaign staffer near the mic stand froze, hand halfway to his earpiece. Karoline Leavitt stood at the podium, her notes untouched, her usual composure flickering like a candle in a draft. She'd handled tough questions before, hecklers, gotcha moments, policy traps, but this wasn't that. This wasn't a trap. It was a wound, laid bare in plain words, and it demanded more than a talking point. She took a breath. Not the kind you take before delivering a rehearsed line, but the kind you take when you're trying to steady yourself. "Thank you for sharing that," she said, her voice softer now, less like a broadcast and more like a conversation. "I can't imagine what that loss feels like." Delia, still seated, didn't look up. She stared at her hands, calloused, scarred from field medicine and years of hauling gear, and nodded once. She hadn't spoken to make a scene. She hadn't even planned to speak at all. But once the words were out, she felt a strange mix of relief and dread. Relief because someone finally said it out loud. Dread because she knew how these things usually went. A moment of sympathy, a vague promise, then back to the script. But Karoline didn't return to the script. Instead, she stepped out from behind the podium. Just a few feet, but it mattered. It made her smaller, more human, less like a figure on a screen and more like someone standing in the same room, sharing the same air. "I want to understand," she said, looking directly at Delia. "What could have been different for your friend? What did the system miss?" That caught Delia off guard. Most officials asked for suggestions in a way that sounded polite but distant, like they were collecting feedback for a report no one would read. But this felt different. There was no defensiveness, no pivot to "we're doing our best." Just a question, plain and open. Delia hesitated, then stood again. "It wasn't one thing," she said. "It was everything. He called the VA hotline every Monday like clockwork. Got the same recording every time. Your call is important to us, but no callback. He tried the online portal. Said it kept freezing when he uploaded his discharge papers. He even showed up in person once, but they told him the mental health department was short-staffed, and he'd need to reschedule." She paused, her throat tight. He wasn't asking for a miracle. Just someone to listen. Just one person to say, "I see you." "I'll help." A murmur rippled through the room. An older man in a Vietnam War cap wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. A woman near the front hugged her arms like she was cold. Karoline didn't interrupt. She just listened. And when Delia finished, she didn't offer a solution right away. Instead, she turned slightly to face the whole room. "This is why we can't just talk about numbers," she said. "A wait time of 3 weeks sounds fine on a chart. But if you're the one waiting, if you're lying awake every night wondering if tomorrow will be the day you finally break, that number means nothing. What matters is whether help shows up before it's too late." Some in the audience nodded. Others looked stunned. This wasn't the polished messaging they'd come to expect. It was raw, real. Then Karoline did something no one anticipated. She walked down the steps from the stage and stopped a few feet from Delia. "Would you be willing to talk more about this? Not here, not now, but maybe with our policy team. We're drafting a new proposal for mental health access, and I'd value your perspective." Delia studied her face. She'd learned long ago to read people. Not just their words, but their eyes, their posture, the way they held silence. And right then, Karoline didn't look like a politician angling for goodwill. She looked like someone who just realized the map she'd been following didn't match the ground beneath her feet. "I'll talk," Delia said slowly, "but only if it's not just for show. Only if you're really listening." "I am," Karoline said, and for the first time that night she sounded like she meant it. Not as a spokesperson, but as a person. The rest of the Q&A felt different after that. Questions still came, but they were quieter, more thoughtful. Someone asked about rural veterans who couldn't travel to big VA centers. Another asked how to support caregivers, the spouses and parents who held things together while their loved ones fought invisible battles. Karoline answered honestly when she could, and when she didn't know, she said so. No spin, no fluff. After the event, as people filed out, a few stopped to thank Delia. One veteran pressed a worn challenge coin into her hand. "For speaking up," he said. Another woman hugged her, whispering, "My brother's going through the same thing. Thank you for saying his name, even if it wasn't his real one." Delia stood by the exit for a while, watching the crowd thin. She felt drained but oddly lighter, like she'd set down a backpack she'd been carrying for years. Then Karoline approached again, this time without her entourage. "I meant what I said," she told Delia. "We're meeting with VA counselors and frontline staff next week in Concord. Would you come?" "Your voice matters," Delia considered it. She'd been burned before, invited to consultations that led nowhere, promised changes that vanished after election season. But something in Karoline's eyes told her this might be different. Or maybe she just wanted to believe it could be. "I'll be there," she said. As she walked to her car, the evening air cool against her face, Delia thought about Javier. Not just how he died, but how he lived. How he'd carried his squad through sandstorms and firefights. How he'd shared his last protein bar with a kid in Mosul. How he'd called his mom every Sunday without fail. He deserved better than silence. Better than bureaucracy. Better than being reduced to a statistic in a speech. And maybe, just maybe, tonight was the first step toward making sure others didn't follow the same path. Back inside, Karoline stood alone for a moment in the emptying room. She glanced at her notes, still pristine, barely touched. Then she folded them and tucked them into her bag. Some lessons she realized couldn't be written down. They had to be lived, and sometimes they came from the quiet woman in the third row who dared to speak the truth no one else would. The video clip spread faster than anyone expected. Just under 2 minutes long, shot on a phone from the back row, but it carried the kind of weight that doesn't need special effects or dramatic music. There was Delia standing calm in her navy jacket, voice steady as she spoke about a friend who never got the help he needed. And then Karoline, stepping away from the podium, listening, really listening, and saying, "I want to understand." No deflection, no spin. Just two people in a room, one carrying grief, the other choosing to meet it instead of sidestep it. By morning, the clip had been shared thousands of times. Veterans forums lit up. News outlets picked it up. Not as a political win, but as something rarer. A moment of genuine human exchange in a world that often feels staged. Some praised Karoline for showing humility. Others accused her of being soft or off-message. A few even questioned if the whole thing was staged because, in today's world, real honesty often looks suspicious. But in a small office above a hardware store in Concord, none of that noise mattered. That's where Delia found herself a week later, sitting at a long table with mismatched chairs, a half-empty coffee pot in the corner, and a whiteboard covered in scribbled notes. Karoline was there, yes, but so were 2 VA social workers, a retired Navy corpsman who now ran a peer support group, and a young woman who'd spent the last 3 years fighting to get her disability rating corrected. No cameras, no press, just people who'd lived the problem, trying to sketch out a solution. At first, the meeting felt stiff. Everyone was polite, careful with their words, testing the waters. Karoline started by thanking them for coming, then laid out the goal: to design a pilot program that would actually reduce wait times for mental health care. Not on paper, but in real life. She didn't talk about legislation or headlines. She asked, "What would have helped your friend?" and looked straight at Delia. Delia took a breath. "It's not just about more therapists," she said. "It's about making it possible for veterans to reach them. The hotline? It's a maze. You press 1 for English, 2 for Spanish, 3 for benefits, 4 for mental health. But then you get transferred, put on hold, disconnected. By the 3rd time it happens, you stop calling." The Navy corpsman nodded. "And even if you get through, they ask for your social security number, your service number, your date of birth. Like you're a suspect, not someone asking for help. It feels like a test you might fail." Karoline scribbled notes not on a fancy tablet but on a legal pad with a chewed-up pen. "What if we created a dedicated line just for mental health crises, staffed by people trained in veteran trauma, not call center scripts?" "A start," said the young woman from the corner. "But what about after hours? My worst nights were at 2 a.m. No one answers then." "Then we staff it 24/7, Karoline said simply. "Even if it's just a skeleton crew. Even if it costs more." Delia raised an eyebrow. "You say that like it's easy." "It's not," Karoline admitted. "But if we keep treating mental health like an afterthought, we'll keep burying people who didn't have to die." The room fell quiet again, but this time it wasn't awkward. It was the kind of silence that comes when people realize they're on the same side. Over the next 2 hours, ideas flowed. One social worker suggested pairing veterans with peer navigators, people who'd been through the system themselves and could walk others through it step by step. Another proposed mobile clinics that could visit rural towns where VA centers were hours away. Delia talked about simplifying the online portal, fewer forms, clearer language, no endless loops of "please verify your identity." Karoline didn't promise everything would happen. She didn't say, "We'll fix it all." Instead, she asked, "Which of these could we test in 6 months? Which one would make the biggest difference for the most people?" They settled on 3. A 24/7 veteran mental health line with live trained responders, a peer navigator program in 3 counties, and a redesigned digital intake form co-created with actual users, not just IT staff. Before they left, Karoline turned to Delia. "Will you help us test it? Not just advise, actually sit in on the design sessions?" Delia hesitated. She'd been burned before by promises that sounded good in a meeting, but vanished once the cameras left. But this felt different. Maybe because Karoline hadn't tried to sell her anything. Maybe because she'd listened more than she'd spoken. "I'll help," Delia said. "But only if you let us say when it's not working. No sugarcoating." "Deal," Karoline said and offered her hand. Delia shook it, firm, brief, but real. Later that week, Karoline gave a short interview to a local radio station. The host asked about the viral moment in Manchester. Was it planned? He wondered. She laughed softly. "If I could plan moments like that, I'd be a lot better at this job." "No, it was real. And it reminded me why I got into this work in the first place. Not to win arguments, but to fix things that are broken." Back home, Delia replayed the meeting in her head as she watered her tomato plants on the porch. She still didn't fully trust the system. But for the first time in years, she felt like maybe, just maybe, someone in a position to change it was finally willing to look it in the eye. And that, she thought, was worth showing up for. Meanwhile, in her office, Karoline pinned a quote to her bulletin board, something Delia had said during the meeting. "Help shouldn't be a reward for how well you can navigate bureaucracy. It should be there because you served." She didn't know if the pilot would succeed, but she knew this. If they got it right, even for a few dozen veterans, it would be worth every awkward meeting, every skeptical headline, every late-night rewriting proposals. Because sometimes, the most unbelievable reaction isn't anger or applause, It's the quiet courage to change course when you realize you've been heading the wrong way all along. The first test call came in at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. It wasn't part of a press release. There were no cameras, no speeches, no ribbon cutting. Just a quiet ring in a small call center tucked inside a converted office building in Nashua. The pilot mental health line, staffed by 2 trained responders, both veterans themselves, had gone live that morning. By evening, the phones were already ringing. The caller was a man in his late 30s, voice rough like he hadn't slept in days. He didn't give his name, just said he'd served in Afghanistan, that the nightmares had gotten worse since his dog died last month, and that he'd been sitting in his truck outside a 24-hour pharmacy for over an hour, trying to decide whether to go home or just keep driving. The responder on the line, Lena, a former Army sergeant with 10 years of experience in crisis counseling, didn't ask for his social security number, didn't put him on hold, didn't tell him to call back during business hours. She just said, "You're not alone. Let's talk." For 43 minutes they did. She listened, asked gentle questions, offered options, not orders, just choices. By the end, he agreed to let her connect him with a local peer support volunteer who could meet him at a diner down the street. Not a therapist, not a case file, just another veteran who'd been through the dark and knew the way back. When the call ended, Lena sat back in her chair, eyes damp. She'd taken hundreds of crisis calls before, but this one felt different, because this time the system hadn't failed him at the first step. This time someone answered. News of the pilot program spread quietly, the way real change often does, not through viral clips but through word of mouth. A veteran told his buddy. A counselor mentioned it to a client. A VA nurse slipped a card with the number into a patient's discharge packet. Within 3 weeks, the line was getting over 200 calls a week. Most weren't emergencies, just people looking for someone who understood the weight of a uniform long after it's been hung up. Delia visited the call center one rainy afternoon. She didn't come as an advisor or a spokesperson. She came as herself, coffee in hand, boots squeaking on the wet floor. Lena greeted her with a tired smile and showed her around. They sat in on a few calls with permission, watched how the responders used plain language, avoided jargon, never rushed. "This is what I've been asking for," Delia said softly, after listening to a young woman describe her panic attacks before a job interview. Not perfection, just humanity. Back in Concord, Karoline was knee-deep in budget meetings and policy drafts. The pilot was small, just 3 counties, a fraction of the state, but it was drawing attention. Some party leaders were uneasy. "It's too soft," one said during a strategy call. "Focus on border security or the economy. This mental health stuff doesn't win elections." Karoline didn't argue. She just said, "Then we'll do it anyway." She'd started visiting VA clinics unannounced, not for photo ops, but to sit in waiting rooms, talk to staff, watch how things actually worked. Once, she spent an entire morning helping an elderly veteran fill out a benefits form, because the online system kept rejecting his submission. Her aides were nervous. What if someone recorded it? What if it looked staged? But Karoline didn't care. "If it looks real," she said, "it's because it is." Meanwhile, the Peer Navigator program began pairing veterans with trained volunteers who'd walked the same path. One man, a former Marine struggling with isolation after his wife left, was matched with a retired Navy cook who lived 10 miles away. They met for coffee every Thursday. No agenda, just conversation. After 6 weeks, the Marine started attending a local support group. After 12, he volunteered to help at a food pantry. Small things, quiet victories, but they added up. Delia and Karoline met again, this time not in a conference room but at a diner off Route 3. No staff, no notes. Just 2 women sharing a booth picking at pie. "You really didn't have to keep your word," Delia said after a long silence. Karoline looked up from her coffee. "Why wouldn't I?" "Because most people don't," Delia replied. "They say the right things when the spotlight's on. Then they move on." Karoline stirred her coffee slowly. "I used to think policy was about big speeches and bold plans. But that night in Manchester, you showed me it's about the space between the words. The silence after someone says, 'I can't do this anymore.' What we do in that silence, that's what matters," Delia nodded. She still didn't trust politics, but she was starting to trust the person across the table. A few days later, Karoline received a letter. It wasn't from a donor or a lobbyist. It was handwritten on lined notebook paper from the man who'd called the crisis line that first night. He didn't ask for anything, just said thank you, for the voice that answered, for the volunteer who showed up, for not making him feel like a burden. "You gave me a reason to stay," he wrote. "That's more than I've had in years." She read it 3 times. Then she pinned it to the wall beside Delia's quote. Outside, the world kept spinning. Headlines blared, campaigns raged, opinions clashed. But in New Hampshire, something quieter was growing. Not a revolution, not a miracle. Just a handful of people choosing to show up, to listen, to try again even when the system had failed too many times to count. And sometimes, that's enough to change everything. The day of the policy announcement was overcast, the kind of gray sky that feels like it's holding its breath. The venue wasn't a grand hall or a government building. It was the same community center in Manchester where it all began, just a few months earlier. Folding chairs lined the room again, but this time, the front row was filled not with campaign volunteers, but with veterans, some in wheelchairs, some with service dogs at their feet, some wearing ball caps faded from years of sun and rain. Delia sat near the back, arms crossed, watching quietly. She hadn't wanted to come, not because she doubted the work, but because she still carried the weight of every promise that had come before and vanished like smoke. Karoline walked in without fanfare. No entourage, no dramatic music, just a folder in her hand and the same calm stride she'd had that first night. She didn't head straight to the podium. Instead, she moved through the room, shaking hands, nodding, listening to a few quick words from people she recognized from the pilot program meetings. When she finally stepped up to speak, she didn't open with statistics or slogans. She started with a name. "Javier," she said, voice steady. "I never met him, but I've heard about him from someone who did, someone who held his dog tags and buried a friend the system failed." She paused. "We can't bring him back, but we can make sure his story isn't repeated." Then she laid out the plan, not as a political victory, but as a living thing, still growing. The 24/7 veteran mental health line would expand to all 10 counties in the state by summer. The Peer Navigator program, which had already connected over 300 veterans with trained volunteers, would be funded for another 2 years. And the redesigned digital intake form, tested and refined with direct input from users like Delia and others, would go live statewide next month, cutting the average application time in half. But the most surprising part came near the end. "This won't be run from a distant office," she said. "Veterans will help shape it every step of the way. We're creating a permanent advisory council, made up of frontline workers, counselors, and veterans themselves, to review what's working and what's not. No more designing help for people without asking them what they actually need." A few people in the audience exchanged glances. It sounded almost too simple, too honest. In a world where policy often felt like theater, this felt like repair. When Karoline finished, there was no standing ovation. Just a slow, steady round of applause, warm but measured. These were people used to disappointment. They'd learned to hope quietly, if at all. Afterward, Delia lingered near the coffee table, stirring sugar into a cup she didn't really want. Karoline found her there. "You came," Karoline said. "I wanted to see if you'd say his name," Delia replied. "And?" "You did." "That matters." They stood in silence for a moment, watching people file out. Some stopping to thank Karoline, others just heading home, shoulders a little less tight than when they'd arrived. "I know it's not everything," Karoline said softly. "It's not even close to fixing the whole system." "No," Delia agreed. "But it's real, and that's more than I expected." Later that week, Delia visited the outreach center where she volunteered. A young woman, newly discharged, eyes shadowed with exhaustion, sat in the waiting area, twisting a frayed strap on her backpack. Delia recognized the look. It was the same one Javier had worn the last time she saw him. She sat beside her. "First time here?" she asked. The woman nodded. "I don't even know where to start." Delia smiled gently. "You already did. You showed up." She handed her a card with the new crisis line number. Clean, simple, no fine print. "Call this any time, day or night. Someone will answer, and they'll understand." The woman took it like it was something precious. That same afternoon, Karoline sat in her office reviewing feedback from the first month of the expanded hotline. Call volume was up. Wait times were under 2 minutes. Over 80% of callers said they felt heard and respected. It wasn't perfect. Some rural areas still struggled with internet access for telehealth. And staffing remained tight, but it was moving. Her phone buzzed. A text from Lena, the crisis responder. Just got off a call with a vet who said this line kept him from walking into traffic tonight. He's meeting his peer navigator tomorrow. Thought you'd want to know. Karoline read it twice. Then she leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes for a long moment. This was why. Not the speeches. Not the headlines. This quiet, stubborn act of showing up for people when the world had turned away. Weeks turned into months. The pilot became a program. The program became a model other states started asking about. Karoline never claimed credit. In interviews, she always pointed back to the veterans, the counselors, the volunteers. They built this, she'd say. I just helped clear the path, and Delia, she kept working, still helping fill out forms, still driving veterans to appointments, still carrying the weight, but now it felt a little lighter. Because now when someone called the hotline and got through on the first ring, she knew she'd had a hand in that. When a peer navigator sat with someone in a diner at midnight, she knew that seed had been planted in a quiet room full of honest words. One evening, as autumn turned to winter, Delia walked past the community center again. A poster in the window advertised a support group meeting. Beneath it, someone had taped a small note. If you're hurting, call. Someone's listening. She didn't go in. But she smiled, because the truth hadn't fixed everything. Wars still left wounds that never fully healed. Bureaucracy still moved too slow. But something had shifted, not in grand gestures, but in daily choices. In a politician who chose to listen instead of perform. In a veteran who chose to speak instead of stay silent. In a system that, for once, bent toward people instead of making them bend to it. And sometimes, that's how real change begins. Not with a bang, but with a voice saying, I see you, and another voice daring to believe it.